Ever since man went to war, military commanders have faced the problem of getting their troops quickly and safely to the battlefront. During the last century, while tanks slugged it out from a distance, the armored infantry fighting vehicles were the ones that delivered the troops to the center of the combat zone and helped to win the battle. Now, Top 10 will test, assess, and grade the most feared and powerful infantry fighting vehicles in military history. For almost a century, hundreds of armored fighting vehicles have been designed and built to fight their way to the battlefield, deliver their troops into harm's way, and get them safely back. Based on scientific analyses, expert opinion, audience polls, and technical comparison, we've constructed a 5-point matrix that will rank the top 10 infantry fighting vehicles of all time. First up, a vehicle that is fast becoming an icon of the American land forces.
The Humvee M1114. Manufacturer, AM General. Power plant, General Motors 190 horsepower diesel engine. Maximum speed, 78 miles per hour. Carrying capacity, driver and 3 troops. Armor, classified. Armament, 1.50 caliber machine gun. Range, 275 miles.
When, in the late 1970s, a call went out from the U.S. military to develop a vehicle to replace the much-loved and ubiquitous Jeep, the winning design had to be exceptional.
The Jeep was a general-purpose vehicle. You could drive around in it, and you could move stuff around in it. But the platform was old, and the U.S. Armed Forces decided it needed something new. And they did a study, and they thought about what they really needed in a quarter-ton truck.
And the answer to that need came when in 1980, AM General revealed their high-mobility, multi-purpose wheeled vehicle, or Humvee for short. The U.S. military were impressed, and orders for 60,000 vehicles were granted. And in 1985, the Humvee went into service. But along the way, the world had changed, and along with it, so did the Humvee. It now came in over 12 different configurations, from armored carrier to special operations vehicle, from missile platform to recoilless rifle vehicle, from ambulance to reconnaissance unit. But was the Humvee being stretched too far? Questions were being asked of it.
The Humvee, like its parallel vehicles in other militaries, was designed for peacetime or post-conflict peaceful stability operations, not for an insurgency. For a 360-degree war of the cities, of insurgents, we've now decided that everything has to be armored, and the Humvee is struggling to react to that reality.
Despite this, with a low center of gravity that can take it over most terrain and a top speed of 78 miles per hour, this tough little vehicle is still capable of carrying its load of 1 crew and 3 troops over a range of 275 miles, and has seen stellar service in Somalia, Iraq, and Afghanistan. Criticized by some for their vulnerability, the sheer usefulness of the Humvee has led to their being used in situations which actually call for much more heavily armed and armored vehicles.
I'm worried about its survivability. It's being forced into roles that it wasn't designed for. It was basically an end of the 20th century Jeep. It's now being classed as something else, but if you're going to use it for warfighting roles, you've got to put a lot of armor on the sides, on the roof, particularly on the belly for mines.
The Humvee has earned its worldwide reputation for being a tough fighter, and with over 160,000 being built and sold to over 36 countries, it scores high on our production rating. Innovation is also good. Because of its shortcoming in action, its service length lets it down, as does its mobility rating and carrying capability. But the Humvee is certainly good enough to get into 10th place in our top 10 infantry fighting vehicle list. Next up in the top 10 infantry fighting vehicles is one that, at first sight, might be seen as the oddball in our list. But without it, World War II might never have been won.
The LVT-4 Alligator. Manufacturer, Food Machinery Corporation. Power plant, one Continental 250 horsepower radial gasoline engine. Maximum speed, 25 miles per hour on land, 7 miles per hour on water. Carrying capacity, 6 crew and 30 troops. Armor, 0.5 inches. Armament, 2.50 caliber and 2.30 caliber machine guns. Range, 300 miles on road, 75 miles on water.
Known as amphibious tractors, or Amtraks for short, the LVTs were the backbone for the Marine landings during the long and bloody campaigns of the Pacific War. But the original idea of an amphibious landing craft came not from the USA, but from Japan.
The only people at the beginning of the Second World War who had purpose-built amphibious assault equipment were the Japanese. As an island nation, the Japanese understood that they would have to, in a modern war, conduct amphibious operations. And it is, in fact, the Japanese who invent modern amphibious landing equipment.
By mid-1943, America was clawing back the Japanese-held islands of the Pacific. In order to get the troops onto the beaches, a vehicle was needed that not only landed the troops, it had to protect them as well. In the past, they had the Higgins boat or landing craft, but they needed something else. And the answer was the LVT Mark IV. Introduced in 1944, it was innovative by having a rear door so that either a jeep or gun could be unloaded. But more importantly, it also saved countless Marine lives as they disembarked.
Having a vehicle that wouldn't simply land on the beach, drop the bow, and have everybody run out into harm's way, but actually go onto the beach, transition onto land, provide a platform from which you could actually fight, as well as protection for the squad on board, was a real revolutionary change in amphibious warfare.
The LVT carried anything from 30 to 50 caliber machine guns, and even 75 millimeter howitzers that could deliver a hail of fire to protect its 30 disembarking troops.
The LVTs worked in teams, where they were almost miniature armies, if you will, where they put artillery in and then softened up the target, followed by infantrymen, and even had repair LVTs, which were outfitted with winches and could conduct major repairs on the beach. And they would simply go from island to island to island, clearing out the Japanese.
So indispensable was the LVT that a version called the Buffalo was used by the Allied forces in many river crossings during the war in Europe.
When you're going to conduct a cross-channel invasion of Europe, and when you know there is a number of north-south flowing rivers you're going to have to cross, and when you know that a lot of these rivers, if you cross them where you'd like to, are really wide, like the Lower Rhine, that you might actually need to have amphibious vehicles to do it.
So respected was the LVT that Vice Admiral Cochrane, USN, wrote, "There is not the slightest shadow of doubt that the overwhelming victories of our forces at Tarawa, Kwajalein, Saipan, Tinian, Palau, and Iwo Jima would not have been possible without the Amtraks." This endorsement alone puts the LVT's innovation rating high, and with over 1,900 LVT-4s built, its production score is good, as is its carrying capability. But its service length and mobility mark it down, so the LVT-4 comes in at 9th place in our top 10 infantry fighting vehicles. Next, the vehicle that became the face of the U.S. forces in World War II and has kept on going ever since.
The M3 half-track. Manufacturer, White Motor Company. Power plant, White 147 horsepower gasoline engine. Maximum speed, 45 miles per hour. Carrying capacity, 2 crew and 11 troops. Armor, 0.5 inches. Armament, 1.50 caliber machine gun. Range, 180 miles.
Inspired by a 1931 French design, the basic M3 went into service in 1941. Used throughout the U.S. Army, it was an essential part of the armored divisions. with each motorized infantry battalion having an establishment of 62.
Everybody loved it, and for good reason. An incredibly robust vehicle, very well made, powered front axle, very important in a APC or anything having cross-country capabilities. Had a banded track, so there's no links to brake. It's actually just a big rubber band encasing 2 steel cables.
Capable of carrying 1 crew and 12 troops over all terrain, the M3, with a top speed of 45 miles per hour, was rapidly seen as a vital part of any frontline action.
What had been clearly learned early in World War II, and is probably the dominant lesson of armored warfare of the last 50, 60 years, is that you have to have infantry along with your tanks. Tanks look big and bad, you separate them from the infantry, and they're sitting ducks.
And the M3 was more than just an infantry carrier. With 0.5 inches of armor and capable of carrying a variety of weapons, it was a ferocious fighter.
Decent armor, I mean nothing that's going to protect a major round, but good enough for small arms. Most of the models could mount a 50 caliber machine gun, which was 12.7 millimeters, the biggest anti-personnel weapon that the U.S. fielded in World War II.
By the end of World War II, the M3 had seen service in almost every theater of war, and over 40,000 M3 half-tracks had been produced in a wide variety of configurations, such as personnel carrier, artillery tractor, and communications vehicle. But the M3 story did not stop there. Upgraded to carry quad 50 caliber machine guns, it was used extensively during the Korean War, and incredibly, is still going strong.
The Israelis still use the M3 half-track today, and you can drive around northern Israel and see parking lots that are absolutely full of M3 half-tracks. And it's not because the Israelis don't have other battle taxis, because they do. But the Israelis, to this day, use the American M3 half-track of the Second World War as a mortar carrier, as an engineering vehicle, anything you need on the battlefield that's got to keep up with the tanks you can stick in the back of the old M3 half-track.
For many, the M3 has become the face of infantry fighting vehicles, so service length scores high in our matrix, as does production rating. Mobility and carrying capability are medium, but innovation is low. But good enough to get the number 8 spot in our top 10 infantry fighting vehicles. Coming up, the oldest and smallest vehicle in our list, but one with a big heart that became the unsung hero of the British Army.
The British Universal Carrier. Manufacturer, Thornycroft. Power plant, 1 Ford 85 brake horsepower engine. Maximum speed, 30 miles per hour. Carrying capacity, 2 crew and 4 troops. Armor, 0.35 inches. Armament, 1.303 machine gun. Range, 130 miles.
After the stalemate of trench warfare during World War I, Britain decided it needed a fast, mobile troop carrier that could take the fight to the enemy over any terrain. The result was unveiled in 1934 and called the British Universal Carrier.
You ever seen a universal carrier? It is an almost comically tiny little thing. It looks like a toy, and it's dwarfed by a couple of strapping soldiers sitting in it. It looks bizarre, but what it does is it enables you to move around the battlefield over all kinds of terrain, the kind of thing that in the old days you'd slap on a horse.
By 1938, and with 0.35 inches of armor, the Universal Carrier had acquired a nickname after the 303 machine gun it carried.
Most Brits call it the Bren gun carrier after the weapon system which it carried, but it also carried things like the Boys anti-tank rifle and could pull trailers and things like 6-pounder anti-tank weapons. So I think that the Bren carrier is a typical example of British ingenuity in that period at the end of the 1930s when there was no money to rearm.
And when in 1939 World War II began, the little 12-foot-long Bren gun carrier with a top speed of 30 miles per hour went to war.
There must have been several thousand that went to France in 1940 to try and support the French army in the event of a German invasion. When the Germans did invade, a lot of the equipment, in fact, the bulk of the British army, in France. Most of the kit was left there, whether that was field guns or rifles or Bren gun carriers. Now the Germans, being equally technically minded, saw the potential of this vehicle and pushed it into service.
In fact, no other vehicle was used by soldiers from both sides of the conflict as the Bren gun carrier. Although designed to carry only 4 troops, it was not unusual to see it carrying 6, 8, 10, or even 12 men and all their gear. As the war progressed, so did the universal carrier, from troop carrier to flamethrower, from mortar platform to medevac. It was everywhere. It was also capable of being glider-borne by being airlifted with a 6-pound anti-tank gun. It seemed that there was nothing that the universal carrier could not do.
In just about every theatre of war, particularly Northwest Europe and the North African desert, this is the vehicle you had to have. It almost became a status symbol.
By war's end, nearly 100,000 of these sturdy little fighters had been built, and the universal carrier remained in service until the mid-1950s. So on our matrix, it scores high for production rating, as does its innovation and service length. Marked down is its carrying capability and mobility rating, but not that low. It earned 7th place in our top 10 infantry fighting vehicle list. Next up in our top 10 infantry fighting vehicles, a Cold War warrior from the Soviet Union that changed the shape of fighting vehicle design.
The Soviet Bronovaya Mashina Piechota BMP-1. Manufacturer, Kurgan-Marschalot, JSC. Power plant, UTD 300 horsepower diesel engine. Maximum speed, 40 miles per hour. Carrying capacity, 3 crew and 8 troops. Armor, 1.3 inches. Armament, 1 73mm cannon, 1 7.62mm machine gun. Range, 375 miles.
During the mid-1960s, at the height of the Cold War arms race, the Soviet Union introduced the Bronovaya Mashina Piechota, or BMP-1. The BMP-1 represented a shift from the concept of an armored personnel carrier to that of an infantry fighting vehicle, combining high mobility, anti-tank weapons, and armored protection for carrying troops.
BMP-1 really was revolutionary. The idea was the father to all the other modern infantry fighting vehicles. I mean, this was a vehicle that truly made the transition from just being a carrier of infantry troops and other things to actually being a self-contained armored fighting vehicle as well.
But more revolutionary was the fact that, for the first time in infantry fighting vehicle design, the BMP had a roof that could protect its troops. As soon as it was revealed in 1967, the BMP sent shivers of fear throughout the Western Allies.
It was the nightmare of every NATO commander in Northwest Europe to have thousands of these vehicles full of Warsaw Pact soldiers coming at them, because they would be difficult to engage the infantry. So yes, I think in overall terms, this was a milestone vehicle.
With a top speed of 40 miles per hour, the BMP was able to carry a 3-man crew plus 8 troops over a range of 375 miles on all terrain, including water. Also, with its 73mm cannon, 1 7.62mm machine gun, and the ability to fire fin-stabilized anti-tank heat missiles, it seemed that the Soviets were onto a winner.
When the infantry is carried into battle and through the battle, safer because they're in an armored hull, and that armored hull can also shoot back at your tanks. So this really said that the Soviets were really going to one-up us in the kind of massive armored battles that we expected to see in Europe during the Cold War.
Another innovation that the BMP boasted was the ability for the troops to fight within the vehicle, rather than dismount and lose the protection of its armor.
Little teardrop-shaped ports on the side allowed the soldiers inside to protrude their AK-47s out and shoot. It certainly gives a good sense of security to the soldier inside, but perhaps not the most practical thing as you're speeding by the enemy and without really a lot of visual reference.
But although the BMP revolutionized armored warfare, it was not without drawbacks. The armor was thin, and the low silhouette made it cramped for crew and passengers. This forced the Soviet designers to come up with a novel way to find extra space for its troops.
If you open up the back of a BMP-1, you see that the rear doors seem really, really thick. And you wonder, wow, is that some kind of super thick armor meant to protect the guys inside? No, it's a fuel tank. And if a BMP takes a round up the backside, in particular if it takes an incendiary round up the backside, everybody inside is showered with burning fuel and everybody dies.
The BMP-1's vulnerability was shown by the serious losses it suffered in the Middle East War of 1973. Its successor, the BMP-2, has seen combat in many major hotspots, including with the Taliban in Afghanistan and Saddam's forces in Iraq. No exact numbers are known as to how many BMPs were built, but it must be in the tens of thousands. So for its production rating, it scores high, as does its service length. Our matrix also gives it a good score for mobility and carrying capability. Its innovation score is marked down due to its flaws in design, but it's still good enough to make number 6 in our top 10 infantry fighting vehicles. Halfway through our top 10 infantry fighting vehicles comes the one that showed the way for all others, one that supported the Nazi blitzkrieg invasion throughout Europe.
The German Sonderkraftfahrzeug 251. Manufacturer Hanomag. Power plant Maybach 100 brake horsepower gasoline engine. Maximum speed 33 miles per hour. Carrying capacity 2 crew and 10 troops. Range 112 miles. Armor 0.6 inches. Armament 2 7.92mm machine guns.
During the 1930s, when the world was frantically rearming, the German army began developing its new theory of land-based blitzkrieg tactics.
Heinz Guderian, the German commander who becomes essentially the inventor of the Panzer Division, says that within a division, within a Panzer Division, you must have tanks, but you must also have infantry who can keep up with the tanks, the Panzer Grenadiers.
The result was one of the most important fighting vehicles of its time, the Hanomag 251 half-track, capable of taking 2 crew and 10 troops over all terrain at a top speed of 33 miles per hour.
It was the forerunner of everything else that came behind it in the way of infantry carrying vehicles, and also because of the quality of the design. I mean, it may have been over-designed in terms of what was needed for a world war, but the design itself was innovative and, sexy and superb.
Initially armed with 2 7.92mm machine guns and protected by 0.6 inches of armor, the 251 swept across Europe and Russia, supporting the Nazi panzer brigades.
If you've got an all-arms division based around the tank, it does you no good if the tanks go racing across the country with their big trucks able to cross sand or swamp, and they leave their supporting infantry behind.
Taking part in every major battle fought by the German army in World War II, the Hanomag 251's outstanding cross-country ability was due to their unique, sophisticated track system. But the 251 was also a victim of its own success.
Their half-tracks were extremely expensive to manufacture. They all lacked a powered front axle. And their track system used an interleaved road wheel arrangement, which was quite prone to clogging with mud or stones. And the tracks were a lubricated track, which required a lot of maintenance. So for constant cross-country use, the vehicle was very difficult to maintain.
But maintenance difficulties aside, over 20 different variants of the Hanomag 251 were produced, from an anti-tank, anti-aircraft vehicle to a field ambulance and mobile gun platform. There was even a rocket launcher variant known as the Infantry Stuka, or Howling Cow. It seemed that there was nothing that the Hanomag 251 could not do.
In terms of innovation, the Hanomag, I think, is excellent because it does demonstrate that you can create vehicles that can keep up with the logistics support you need for main battle tanks. And from that sprang other designs in other countries. So it's a benchmark vehicle.
By war's end, over 16,000 Hanomag 251s were built, and a variant was used by the Czech Army until the late 1970s. Our Matrix evaluation scores production rating as high, as does its innovation factor. Its service length is also good, with mobility and carrying capability scoring just as well. So the Hanomag 251 half-track punches its way into the number 5 spot of the top 10 infantry fighting vehicles. Coming up next in our top 10 infantry fighting vehicles, the latest recruit into the U.S. Army.
The M1126 Striker Infantry Carrier Vehicle. Manufacturer, General Dynamics Land Systems. Power plant, 1 Caterpillar 350 horsepower diesel engine. Maximum speed, 62 miles per hour. Carrying capacity, 2 crew and 9 troops. Armor, classified.